This week on the Big Story Podcast, the deadly legacy of a long and costly war.
This sad part of the war should be a lesson for all governments, but more particularly for the American governments, because it tells them they were at the apex of their power, and at the apex of power you are blind.
Millions of gallons of Agent Orange sprayed across Vietnam by the U.S. Air Force.
It enters into your bloodstream and then your DNA, and it lives there as a time bomb.
Thousands of children born with defects caused by chemical pollutants.
One of the more tragic consequences is the women who served in Vietnam. Research has now shown that for 20 years, they can carry within their bodies the genetic code that will pass on to their children illnesses and cancers compared to people who didn't serve in Vietnam.
My husband was a farmer. We got married in 1999 and had our first child in 2000. In 2008, we had another child, Thuong, who was born without feet and hands.
Next on the Big Story Podcast. Hi, I'm Joe Zarinko, a producer here at Big Story. 50 years after the Vietnam War ended, there are thousands of children in the country bearing the marks of chemical weapons used during the conflict. Chemicals like the dioxin contained in Agent Orange, a defoliant used to strip away vegetation that was spread indiscriminately over large swaths of forests so that local combatants couldn't use them to hide. Long after the last shot was fired, this highly toxic herbicide continued to poison the soil and water streams, scarring generation after generation of Vietnamese. Our senior correspondent, Jason Motlow, traveled to Southeast Asia to report on the legacy of Agent Orange and the conflict. This episode of the Big Story Podcast is called Toxic: U.S. Chemical Warfare in Vietnam.
This is the decision I have made. In cooperation with the armed forces of South Vietnam, attacks are being launched this week to clean out major enemy sanctuaries on the Cambodian-Vietnam border. Tonight, American and South Vietnamese units will attack the headquarters for the entire communist military operation in South Vietnam. Our purpose is not to occupy the areas. Once enemy forces are driven out of these sanctuaries, and once their military supplies are destroyed, we will withdraw.
This is an excerpt from a televised address given by President Richard Nixon in April 1970. It marked the beginning of the Vietnam conflict with the Cambodian campaign, probably the most violent phase of the war. Now let's hear from Jason Motlow, who went to the same area Nixon was referring to more than 50 years later.
In the back streets of this southern Vietnamese town, Hoai Thuong keeps her mother Tran company as she prepares fish to sell at the market. Hoai is 15 years old and would be in school with everyone else, were it not for the fact that she was born without hands and feet. Nearly 50 years after the Vietnam War ended, Hoai is one of thousands of children born with defects caused by Agent Orange, a chemical defoliant sprayed by the U.S. military over vast swaths of southern Vietnam to suppress enemy Vietcong activity. Cu Chi, a hotly contested district near the former capital of South Vietnam, was one of the most heavily targeted areas in the country.
After the war, my parents moved to Go Noi village. I stayed there until I grew up and got married and moved to Cu Chi. My husband was a farmer. We got married in 1999 and I had our first child in 2000. In 2008, we had another child, Thuong, who was born without feet and hands. After I gave birth to her, the doctors dared not to tell me the truth. They were afraid that I would be shocked. After 8 hours, they told me that she had no arms. In the evening of that day, they added that she had no feet. That's all they told me. After giving birth to Hao Thuong, I tried to commit suicide several times. It felt like it was the end of the world. Many of my friends looked down at me. In the end, I quit my job so I could stay home with my child. But our lives became much more difficult. It was miserable. I tried to commit suicide several times, but luckily my husband realized it. He told me to just accept our fate. Hoi Thuong was very smart when she was a child, but she was not aware of her situation then. Now she is 15 years, so there have been changes in her thinking. She has become more reserved than before. She feels ashamed when she goes out.
It's estimated that the U.S. Air Force sprayed about 20 million gallons of Agent Orange and other herbicides over Vietnam in the span of a decade. At the time, though, very little was known about the potential effects of this poisonous pesticide on the health of the people living in those areas. Here's what the veteran war photographer Tran Quoc Viet, also known as Uncle Viet, told Jason about those days.
When the U.S. planes spread toxic chemicals on the land, it looked like heavy rain. The toxic chemicals were found on the top of trees, in clothes, ditches, and water jars. In the ditches, it appeared like floating membrane on the water surface. The membrane was found floating on every water surface. We understood it was a toxic chemical, but we did not know its effects. It was only after our independence that we heard about the Agent Orange and Dioxin and learned how scary its effects were. I must say, the war between the two countries generally was so cruel. But the chemical was not like the bombs. Bombs explode and killed people right away. But the chemical remains through generations.
Agent Orange contains dioxin, a highly toxic organic pollutant that's linked to cancers, diabetes, birth defects, and a host of other disabilities. Dioxin can remain toxic in the soil for decades before it breaks down. It can enter the food supply through the fat of fish and other animals.
Ho Thi Lien lived next to an airport in Vietnam, an area heavily contaminated with Agent Orange.
At that time, there was no clean water to drink. I was drinking bombed and dirty water. I only found out about it later.
In 2003, when she got married and moved to a nearby farm, she got pregnant.
It happened one after another. As soon as I was 5 months pregnant, I had a miscarriage. After that, I gave birth to one child every year. After my miscarriages and premature births, I finally had 3 children left. Finally, for the last and 4th child, the labor process didn't happen. The brain did not grow. After the birth, the baby had no skull. The child lived for 2 years and passed away. After that, I didn't have the strength to give birth again. I was so scared.
The Red Cross estimates that 3 million Vietnamese have been affected by the chemical dioxin. That includes at least 150,000 children born with serious birth defects. U.S. veterans exposed to Agent Orange during the Vietnam War have also been adversely affected, and children born to them have had multiple health issues. This is Professor Larry Berman, a political scientist with the University of California and author of several books about the Vietnam War.
When you're hit by napalm, for example, or a napalm bomb drops, the effect is immediate. You know, your skin burns, it peels from your skin, it peels from your body. It's painful. But Agent Orange is the exact opposite of that. It enters into your bloodstream and then your DNA. And it lives there as a time bomb, literally. And so that's where you get these notions where veterans will say, you know, I died in Vietnam, but I just didn't know it. One of the more tragic consequences is the women who served in Vietnam. Research has now shown that for 20 years, they can carry within their bodies the genetic code that will pass on to their children illnesses and cancers compared to people who didn't serve in Vietnam. So it's almost impossible to talk about Vietnam and the consequences of Agent Orange without thinking about the fact that it's a decade or a decade and a half before we know.
As of 2023, the U.S. Congress has allocated more than $139 million for health and disability programs in 8 provinces sprayed with Agent Orange. To date, the U.S. has never formally taken responsibility for its use of Agent Orange and its intergenerational impact. All the aid given to Vietnam for people with disabilities is designated as assistance without cause. In 2018, the U.S. and Vietnam completed a joint cleanup of Da Nang Airport, an area contaminated by Agent Orange transport and storage during the war.
We're committed to working with the Vietnamese people to clean up and remediate these sites. We're also committed to helping people in Vietnam with disabilities, regardless of cause. That doesn't mean you have to prove a connection with Agent Orange for you to get assistance from our programs.
But these cleanup efforts are facing a major hurdle as the Trump administration has cut U.S. foreign aid funds across the board. Besides leaving contaminated sites untouched or compromised, the consequences will also fall on the hundreds of victims of Agent Orange, as the president of the Ho Chi Minh Peace Committee points out.
When you visit the victims, the deformed bodies of the victims, the human victims of Agent Orange, into the second and third generation, then, you know, it makes you very uncomfortable. So it takes courage to look straight into those consequences. So that's why in the earlier part of this history of US-Vietnam, Vietnam-US engagement around the issue of Agent Orange, the US side focused mostly on the environment.
While in Vietnam, Jason also spoke with Dr. Nguyen Thi Ngach, a victims' rights activist.
It's not enough they haven't cleaned up the environment in the 27 to 28 places exposed to Agent Orange. They haven't supported all the children with disabilities as well. They just carried out support programs in some provinces and cities. So the demand is huge, but the support is minor. They didn't admit that they were supporting Agent Orange victims either. That's why we're trying to do it on our own. Trying our best to clean up the environment and take good care of the people exposed to toxic chemicals, especially Agent Orange and Dioxin.
Even before the cuts to U.S. aid funds, the U.S. government wasn't supporting cleanup efforts in all the Agent Orange affected areas, a position that has been criticized by many within the U.S. establishment. Here's Professor Berman again.
I think we have an obligation to honor the pledge to clean all of those areas up. I know that so many non-governmental organizations are working in that area right now. And the United States Congress, in the last 20 years, has approved over, I believe, $50 to $100 million in money that goes to Congress. So if one looks at a chart from the first year to the last year, Congress is stepping up more and more, but the fight continues. When it comes to supporting victims both here in Vietnam, it's never going to be enough. It will only be enough when the government accepts responsibility for the children, the second generation and the third generation of those who serve this country honorably, and agrees to compensate them for illnesses that might only be explained by their parents' exposure.
In Vietnam, many are concerned that as the years pass, pressure is fading for the U.S. to take full responsibility and make amends for the consequences of Agent Orange. Let's hear again from the director of the Ho Chi Minh Peace Committee.
This sad, sad part of the war should never written out away from history books. It should be a lesson for all governments, but more particularly for the American governments, because it tells them they were at the apex of their power, and at the apex of power you are blind and you become insensitive. This ability to always look forward for the good of the country, I think that's one of the defining strengths of Vietnam through history and of the Vietnamese nation. So when people say, well, or ask, how can you forgive? Well, it's not that. It's we don't forget.
We'll let Vietnam War veteran Nguyen Long Giang have the last word.
It's been over 50 years now, but the children have not been taken care of in a way that meets our expectations. I think the Americans should recognize the disaster they caused in Vietnam and take responsibility towards the people affected by Agent Orange in Vietnam, including those of the future generations. The war is over, and we just focus on the present. What we care about now is how to heal the wound.
That's all for the Big Story podcast this week. Our thanks to our colleagues Caleb Lopez, Omar Teitelbaum, and Felipe Lozano Pruche here in our CGTN America studios. If you want to check the full-length documentary, we'll drop the links in the show's notes, or you can just go to CGTN Now on Apple TV. Thanks for listening.